2014, what a time to be a gamer. It was the year that Grand Theft Auto 5 was launched for 8th generation consoles, the year The Last of Us got remastered, and the year that many friendships were ended by blue shells once again, thanks to Mario and his karting buddies. Sadly, although there were a lot of great titles released in 2014, there were also a number of stinkers. And so we're back again to remind you of all the awful titles the games industry was kind enough to bestow upon us. By now you should be quite familiar with the rules of this series, but for those of you who aren't, here they are. A game can officially place amongst the 10 worst of 2014 if it was released in at least one territory during that year and received a bare minimum of 7 professional reviews. Those who show up with fewer are forced to live out their days in the underground bunker where we make James work. I'm Peter from TripleJump, and here are the 10 worst games of 2014. Number 10. Enemy Front, Xbox 360, 35%. Sometimes it feels like you can't move for first-person shooters. Sadly though, for every Call of Duty and Battlefield, there are dozens of pale imitations, one of which just happens to be the first entry on our list. Enemy Front tells the story of Robert Hawkins, an American war correspondent, as he recollects his experience of aiding the resistance in Nazi-occupied Europe. If that sounds horrendously cliched to you, that's because it was. The game attempted to keep things fresh by skipping between flashbacks and the present day, but even that couldn't save the plot from feeling derivative. Enemy Front received a middling score of 52% for its PC release, but garnered a thoroughly miserable 35% for its Xbox 360 effort. Most complaints fell into one of two categories. The game was bland, and it was janky as heck. Plagued by bugs and shoddy AI, critics had no choice but to give the game terrible review scores. All in all, Enemy Front was a mishmash of mediocre ideas built upon shoddy technical foundations, and ended up being about as fun as getting trench foot. Which is actually a World War I thing, but whatever, I've said it now, it's too late. Number 9. 4 PM, PC, 35.57%. Up next, we have a game that was almost excluded from this list by our writer thanks to an Excel formatting error. There's no such game as 1600, thank you Microsoft Office, but there is a game called 4 PM, though most who've played it wish that there wasn't. 4 PM follows protagonist Caroline as she awakens after a drunken evening at a nightclub to a voicemail from her boss demanding to know where she is. Once she arrives at work, she's reprimanded, retires to her cubicle to drink some more, and sneaks out of the office when 2 bottles of liquor aren't enough. The story, if you can call it that, was laughable. Clearly there was an attempt to make some sort of point, but most critics were confused as to what that point was. Was 4 PM a commentary on the dangers of alcohol? A warning against drink driving? Heck if I know. If the awful plot wasn't enough to put players off though, then the nauseating graphics, horrible voice acting, and downright offensive portrayals of alcoholism and suicide sure would have been. 4 PM may have only taken around 20 minutes to complete, but that's 20 minutes that could have been spent doing something more enjoyable, like pulling out one of your own wisdom teeth without anesthetic. Next. Number 8. Escape Dead Island, Xbox 360, 32%. It's probably not unfair to say that Dead Island and its standalone expansion, Dead Island Riptide, aren't the best games in the world. But if you like zombies and feel like inflicting a bit of violence upon them, then they are, at the very least, passable. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said of Escape Dead Island. Players take on the role of Cliff, a thoroughly unlikable journalist who travels to Benoit in order to document the unexplained events that have been rumoured to have taken place. Unlike its predecessors, Escape Dead Island lacked any sort of RPG elements, and instead went for a more survival horror style approach, though most players agreed that the only thing scary about the game was just how bad it was. Critics were on the whole unimpressed by Escape Dead Island, with several leveling complaints at its visuals, gameplay, and the overall lack of variety when it came to the missions and enemies. There were some that praised the story, though it was noted that it would have been better as a graphic novel rather than a video game. Luckily, there was a very simple way to escape from Escape Dead Island, and that was by turning off your console. Number 7. Sonic Boom: Rise of Lyric, Wii U, 32%. The Sonic the Hedgehog series has, over the years, had its ups and downs, but few of the low points over the course of the Blue Spiky Lad's 3-decade career have been quite as embarrassing as Sonic Boom: Rise of Lyric. The game follows Sonic, Tails, Knuckles, and Amy as they try to prevent the villainous Lyric from obtaining the Chaos Crystals and using them to power an army of war robots. Upon its release, Sonic Boom: Rise of Lyric was panned by critics. It bore all of the classic symptoms of a bad game, including unwieldy and unresponsive controls, a broken camera system, poor quality graphics, and tedious combat mechanics. It was also repetitive, the level design was uninspiring, and the dialogue was badly written and unfunny. As though all of that weren't enough, Sonic Boom was also buggy as heck, with one glitch in particular allowing players to bypass most of the game by pausing it in the midst of Knuckles' jump so he could soar to infinite heights. Thinking about it though, those players might have been the lucky ones. At least they didn't have to sit through the entire thing, am I right? Sonic Boom, more like Sonic Boo, with no M on the end, because rubbish. Oh, got him. Number 6. Magus, PS3, 32%. We cover a lot of games on this channel that can be described as bad, but it's not very often we're afforded the opportunity to look at a game that's so bad that it ends up being good. Now, to be clear, Magus was not a good game, but it was entertaining as heck. Set in the Waterfall Kingdom, the game revolves around the titular Magus. I'm assuming I'm saying that right. I mean, if I'm not, it's more that the game is saying it wrong and everyone else says it properly. And it tells the story of his escape from imprisonment and subsequent efforts to uncover his true identity and abilities. The game was laughably bad and received criticism for basically everything it tried to do. Its graphics were outdated, with some outlets even going as far to say that some PS2 titles looked nicer. The combat was repetitive, and it had an obscene number of bugs. Perhaps the one thing that Magus did have going for it, though, was it was absolutely hilarious, though not intentionally. The writing, dialogue, and voice acting were so poor that players couldn't help but laugh. And if it hadn't been for the $25 price point, it probably would have been worth picking up a copy for that reason alone. Sadly, Magus was a North American PS3 exclusive, so it's unlikely that we here at TripleJump will get to play it in the future. Now that's the worst thing about this game. Number 5. Recoil, PC, 30.56%. You know what I hate? When companies replace letters in words in an attempt to make their product sound more cool and edgy. Case in point, Recoil. Why does it need the K? What was wrong with spelling it correctly? Alas, shoddy nomenclature was the least of Recoil's problems. The game was an online-only shooter in a similar sort of vein to Counter-Strike, in that players were plopped down into an arena and were tasked with shooting one another. But that's where the similarity to Counter-Strike and other such successful games ends, though, since Recoil was fundamentally broken. Getting into a match wasn't much of a problem, and aside from some painfully long load times, most players found entering a game to be a breeze. It's everything that came after that was a complete mess. One of the main problems was the spawning, as Recoil would often place players into the midst of a gunfight, plonk a whole bunch of them in the same spot, aka the spawn camper's dream, or put them right next to another player who would obviously proceed to shoot them immediately. Aside from this, Recoil was buggy, glitchy, laggy, and just about everything else you wouldn't want a game to be. It's fair to say that the only recoiling players were doing was in horror at the quality of the game. Well done, writer. I like that one. Number 4. Air Conflicts, Vietnam Ultimate Edition, PS4, 30%. There's an old saying relating to something about trying to run before you can walk, but it's clearly not one the developers of Air Conflicts Vietnam Ultimate Edition were familiar with, as they've clearly tried to fly before they could even so much as crawl. The game, which was an enhanced version of the equally plops Air Conflicts Vietnam, placed players into the midst of the Vietnam War and tasked them with participating in various air-based battles. Sounds quite exciting, right? Wrong. Firstly, the visual presentation of the game was sorely lacking. We appreciate the whole thing was set in the 60s, but someone probably should have advised the devs there was no need to use 50-year-old graphics. If players could get past the visuals and the abysmal frame rate, they'd have found a game that was downright boring. The missions were incredibly repetitive, consisting of little more than go to point A, unleash bombs, rinse and repeat. The AI was horrible, and the sound effects were awful. In the devs' defense, though, they did say that they were aiming to create a game that wouldn't require a large time investment. So in that respect, Air Conflicts Vietnam Ultimate Edition was a success, since no one wanted to put any time into it whatsoever. Number 3. Basement Crawl, PS4, 27%. In recent years, developer Bloober Team have been responsible for a number of successful horror games, including the likes of Layers of Fear, Observer, and The Medium. As is often the case though, not all of their works have been hits, as perfectly demonstrated by their 2014 effort, Basement Crawl. The team set out to make a game that was somewhat similar to Bomberman, though by all accounts, Basement Crawl ended up ripping it off rather than paying homage. The game was maze-based and required you to set up traps in order to harm other players, though some might say that enforcing Basement Crawl upon your friends, you'd already harmed them enough. The game was a critical flop, with most outlets agreeing that it was nothing more than a buggy Bomberman clone. There was some praise given to the gameplay, which worked fine when offline, but there was just no reason to pick up a copy of the game when the same thing had been done, and done far better, elsewhere. It was so bad, in fact, that in 2017, Games Radar ranked it as one of their 50 worst games of all time, where it placed higher, i.e. they thought it was worse, than Hooters Road Trip, Lula 3D, and even Hotel Mario. Oh, now that's gotta sting. Number 2. Tenkai Knights Brave Battle, 3DS, 26%. It wouldn't be a worst games of year list without at least one appearance from a shoddy Nintendo handheld title, now would it? As it turns out, Tenkai Knights Brave Battle was not only the second worst game of 2014, but it was also, according to Metacritic at least, the worst 3DS title ever. Unlike many games that appear on these lists, from a technical standpoint, Tenkai Knights Brave Battle was actually just fine. The controls, though a little clunky, did more or less what they were supposed to do, the graphics were okay, and the game ran without bugs and glitches. So how did Tenkai Knights end up with such an abysmal review score if it worked okay? Well, I'm glad you asked, Simon Miller. In short, the whole thing was lazy, serving only as a way to milk money out of a burgeoning anime. Pretty much all of the levels were just slight variations of the first, meaning things got tedious for players very quickly, the difficulty ramped up too quickly, and the story was completely lacking in anything even approaching originality. Tenkai Knights Brave Battle was bland, derivative, and soulless. Small children might have enjoyed it for a short time, but there was absolutely nothing that appealed to anyone else. And number 1, Rambo the video game, PS3, 23%. Here's a fun fact for you. If it weren't for our incredibly stringent worst games commandments, we'd have been forced to cover Rambo the video game in 3 separate entries. Luckily for you, we're not that cruel. So although the PS3, Xbox 360, and PC versions of the game were all abominable, you'll only be forced to hear about how bad the Sony outing was. The rail shooter follows the events of the first 3 films in the Rambo series, with players assuming the role of the eponymous action hero as he makes his way through a number of scenes from the movies. To say critics were unkind to Rambo the video game is something of an understatement. The title was lambasted by everyone who had the misfortune to play it. Among the complaints were Rambo's outdated graphics, generic gameplay, overuse of QuickTime events, and copious quantities of bugs and glitches. On the plus side though, the main story did only take about 3 hours to complete, so whilst the game was a waste of time, at least it wasn't a waste of much time. So well done to you, Rambo the video game, for being the very worst game of 2014. You've won an all-expenses paid trip to the bunker where we make James work. And let me tell you, it's horrible down there.